The blizzard hit Wyoming territory in the winter of 1878 like a living thing, like something with teeth and fury and a personal grudge against every soul foolish enough to be breathing above ground. Eliza Calloway had not planned to be dying tonight. She lay in the narrow cot of the schoolhouse that doubled as her bedroom, the one room she had made her own since arriving in the town of Granger's Pass 6 months ago to take up the position of schoolteacher. The town was small, barely 200 souls pressed between the Laramie Mountains and a frozen creek that people here called Silver Run, and the schoolhouse was the smallest building on the main street, but it had been hers, and she had been proud of it. She had hung curtains the color of dried lavender over the single window. She had laid a braided rug on the pine plank floor. She had stacked her books along the wall beside the chalkboard and called it home with a ferocity that surprised even herself, because home was something she had been without for a very long time. But tonight, the curtains were trembling against the window frame with every gust, and the fire in the pot-belly stove had burned down to almost nothing, and Eliza could not lift herself from the cot to feed it more wood. She had tried twice. Both times the room had spun around her in great lazy circles, and she had fallen back against the pillow with her heart hammering and her whole body shaking with something far worse than cold. The fever had started 3 days ago, with nothing more dramatic than a soreness at the back of her throat and a heaviness behind her eyes. She had taught school anyway, because the children needed her and because she was not the kind of woman who surrendered easily to discomfort. She had taught school the second day, too, though Mrs. Hensley had told her she looked like a ghost and pressed a jar of honey into her hands and said she ought to rest. Eliza had smiled and thanked her and kept right on teaching because she was 22 years old, and she had crossed half the country alone on a stagecoach to reach this little speck of a town, and she was not about to be undone by a sore throat. But this was not a sore throat anymore. The cough had come by the second night, deep and rattling and ugly in a way that frightened her, and the fever had climbed and climbed until she was sweating through her nightgown and then shaking with cold so violent that her teeth chattered, and then sweating again in great waves that left her wrung out and frightened and very, very alone. She had managed to get a note to young Tommy Marsh this morning. He lived with his mother in the house nearest the school, asking him to tell his mother she was unwell. But the storm had rolled in from the northwest before noon, and by the time it was full dark outside, the snow was coming sideways past her window, and the wind was so loud it sounded like the whole mountain was screaming, and nobody had come. She did not blame them. No sensible person would be out in this. She pulled the quilt tighter around herself and tried to stop shaking and failed, and looked at the ceiling of her little room and thought, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that if she did not get warmer and did not get medicine and did not get a doctor, she might not survive this night. The thought was calm. She noted it the way she might note the time of day. And then, underneath the calm, something dark and frightened stirred, because she was 22 years old and she had plans. She had so many plans, and she was not done yet. She thought of her mother, buried in Ohio. She thought of her father, who had walked away when she was 11 and had not come back. She thought of the reason she had come all the way out here, all this distance, which was not adventure and not desperation, but something more complicated than either, a bone-deep need to be useful, to matter somewhere, to plant herself in one place and grow roots so deep that nothing could pull her loose. She had thought she was building that here. She had thought she was finally safe. Outside, the blizzard screamed louder, and Eliza Calloway closed her eyes and prayed, though she was not entirely sure she believed in prayer anymore, and listened to the fire die in the stove, and shook. She did not hear the knock on the door the first time, because she had drifted into something that was not quite sleep and not quite consciousness, a hot and muddled place where the line between dreaming and waking had gone soft. She heard it the second time, 3 hard, heavy blows, the kind that came from a large fist, and her eyes opened, and for a moment she only stared at the ceiling, confused about where she was. The third set of knocks was accompanied by a voice, deep and rough as creek gravel, coming through the plank wall like the sound itself had muscle. "Hello in there. Tommy Marsh's mother sent me. She said somebody here needs help. Eliza pushed herself up onto her elbows. The room swam. She breathed through it, pressed her lips together, found her voice somewhere beneath all the fever and the exhaustion. "It is open," she managed, and even those 3 words scraped her raw. The door opened, and the blizzard came in with him. He had to duck to clear the frame. That was the first thing she registered, the sheer size of him, the way he filled the doorway, the way a mountain fills a valley, just naturally, without apology. He was wearing a buffalo coat dusted white with snow, and his hat was pulled low, and for a moment he was nothing but bulk and cold and the howl of the wind behind him. Then he shut the door, and the wind cut off, and he turned around and pushed back the brim of his hat with one thick gloved finger, and Eliza saw his face. He was not a young man in the way of smooth-cheeked boys, but he was not old either. Somewhere in his early 30s, she would guess, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same granite as the mountains outside, and dark eyes that caught the last faint glow of the dying stove, and reflected it back with a steadiness that was somehow the most reassuring thing she had seen in days. His hair was dark and longer than was fashionable, curling slightly where it had gotten damp against the back of his neck. He had a beard, thick and well-shaped, and beneath the enormous buffalo coat, his shoulders were extraordinary, wide and squared and thick with the kind of muscle that came not from vanity, but from a life of genuine hard use. He looked at her lying in the cot, and something moved through those dark eyes, not pity, which she would have hated, but something more like alarm, quickly controlled. "You are worse than Tommy's mother thought," he said. "I have been better," she admitted, and her voice was a wreck, and she hated it. He pulled off his gloves and his coat in quick, efficient movements, and hung the coat on the peg behind the door, and crossed the room to the stove. He crouched in front of it, even crouching he was enormous, and opened the door and looked inside, and without a word he stood up and went to the wood box in the corner and loaded up his arms and came back and began building the fire back up with a focused, practiced competence that was beautiful to watch, every movement deliberate and sure. In less than 3 minutes, orange light was pushing back against the dark again, and the crackling of burning wood was the most wonderful sound she had ever heard. He stood up from the stove and turned to her and said, "I am Callum Hayes. I come down from the ridge. I have a trapping cabin up above the timberline, and I come into town now and then for supplies." He paused. "I know I look frightening. I just want you to know that Mrs. Marsh sent me specifically. She could not come herself because her youngest has the croup, and she cannot leave him, and she told me you are the schoolteacher, and you are sick, and she was worried." "I know who you are," Eliza said. She had seen him 3 or 4 times when he came into Granger's Pass for his supplies. He was the kind of man that people noticed and then talked about afterward in lowered voices, half admiring, half nervous, and she had heard his name before. "Callum Hayes, they call you the Mountain Man." Something shifted in his expression, and she could not tell if he was amused or tired of it. "They call me a lot of things," he said mildly. "You have a name?" "Eliza Calloway." She tried to sit up straighter and managed about halfway before her arms gave out. "I appreciate you coming. I do not think I am in immediate danger of—" "You are burning up," he said, and crossed to her in 3 long strides and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead before she could react. His hand was enormous. It covered most of her forehead, and the coolness of his skin against her heat made her eyes sting with something embarrassing that was not quite tears. "How long has the fever been this high?" 2 days, maybe 3. I've lost track somewhat." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him assessing, calculating, reaching some decision. Then he pulled his hand back and straightened up, and his jaw was set with the look of a man who has made up his mind about something and is now simply going to do it. "You need the doctor," he said. "Dr. Price is on the other side of town." "I know where he is." She stared at him. Outside, the blizzard was screaming. The wind hit the side of the schoolhouse like something trying to knock it over, and the whole small building shuddered, and the curtains pressed inward against the window glass, and the temperature outside was— she did not even want to think about what the temperature was outside. There was a drift against her front steps that had been 4 feet tall when she had last been able to look, and that had been this morning. The storm had gotten worse since. "You cannot go out in that," she said. "It is a blizzard." "I have been out in worse," he said, and he said it simply, without bravado, the way a man states a fact. "Callum." She used his name without thinking, without the formality that her schoolteacher habits usually demanded, because there was something in this situation, the dying fire and the raging storm, and the fact that she was lying helpless in a nightgown in front of a stranger, that stripped the ceremony right off of everything. "The drifts will be waist-high by now. You do not even know—" "I know this town," he said. "I know every foot of the ground between here and Doc Price's house. I know where the drifts will be and where the road lies under the snow and where the postmarkers are when there is nothing else to see." He had pulled his coat back off the peg and was shrugging into it, and his voice was calm and methodical. "I need you to do 3 things while I'm gone. Feed the fire when it gets low. I put enough wood in that it should last an hour easy. Keep yourself covered, and do not try to get up unless the building is on fire. Can you do that?" She was looking up at him, and something was happening in her chest that had nothing to do with the fever. He was pulling his gloves back on and looking down at her with those steady, dark eyes, and for a moment the whole blizzard outside seemed smaller, like the world had narrowed to this little stove-lit room and this man who was going out into a raging storm for her, a woman he barely knew, without being asked twice. "You will get lost," she said. "People die in storms like this." "Not me," he said, and there was no arrogance in it, just a quiet certainty that somehow she believed entirely. He pulled his hat down and knotted his scarf up around his chin and turned for the door. Then he stopped with his hand on the latch and turned back and looked at her once more across the small room. "I will be back," he said. "I promise you that." And then he opened the door, and the blizzard took him. The cold that swept into the room in the second before he pulled the door shut behind him was like a slap, and then it was gone, and Eliza was alone again, and the fire crackled, and the wind screamed outside, and she lay back against her pillow and thought, "He is going to get himself killed." She thought that, and she was afraid of it in a way that was personal and immediate and surprising, because she had not known Callum Hayes for 10 minutes, and already the idea of something happening to him in that howling dark was unacceptable to her. She watched the fire. She kept herself covered. She did not get up. She prayed again, more sincerely this time. Outside, Callum Hayes put his head down against the white fury and walked. The world beyond the schoolhouse door was nothing but white and black and howling violence. The wind hit him like a wall the moment he stepped off the little porch, driving snow so thick and fast that opening his eyes was almost useless. He could barely see 3 feet in any direction, and those 3 feet were nothing but churning white. The temperature had to be well below 0. He could feel it even through the buffalo coat, which was the finest cold-weather garment he owned, cured and sewn from 3 winter-prime hides, thick enough to stop a wind that would kill a lesser coat. Even through that, the cold was reaching for him. He had not lied to Eliza Calloway. He had been in worse. He had spent 11 winters in the high country of Wyoming territory, trapping beaver and mink along the upper creeks, wintering in a cabin he had built himself from lodgepole pine in a clearing below the tree line, just above the elevation where the pines gave way to rock and sky. He knew cold the way a man knows a difficult neighbor, intimately, reluctantly, with great respect. He knew how to read snow and wind, how to keep his blood moving, how to pace himself so he did not exhaust and sweat and freeze in his own dampness. He had walked through whiteout conditions before. He had found his way by feel and memory when his eyes were useless. He knew this particular stretch of ground the way he knew his own hands. He found the post at the edge of the schoolhouse yard by reaching out through the snow and feeling for it. He got his bearings from that. He counted his paces in his head, knowing that the main street was 12 steps northwest from the school gate, knowing that Doc Price's house and surgery was at the far end of the main street, roughly 400 steps in ordinary conditions, maybe 600 or 700 in drifts. He moved with his chin tucked and his arms a little out from his sides for balance, and he took the drifts at angles when he hit them, working with the slope instead of against it. The cold was extraordinary. It was the kind of cold that was not merely weather, but something else, something that felt intentional, a force that wanted to stop him. His boots punched through crusted snow and sank, and sometimes the drift was knee-high, and sometimes it was above his thigh, and he had to push through with the whole weight of his body, but he kept moving. He thought of the woman in the cot, of the fever flush on her face, and the sound of her voice stripped raw, and the way she had looked at him with those gray eyes. They were gray, he had noticed that, gray and clear and full of a kind of intelligence that watched the world carefully. And he kept moving. Callum Hayes was not a man who talked much about himself. He did not tell people that he had come to Wyoming territory at 21, with nothing but a horse and a rifle and a backpack full of trapping gear, running from something that had already swallowed up his father and 2 of his brothers. He did not tell people that the mountains had become his home in the way that homes are supposed to be, a place where he felt himself, where the noise of the world outside fell away, and he could think and breathe and exist without the pressure of other people's needs and judgments. He did not tell people that he was underneath the size and the silence and the mountain man reputation, a man who was deeply and quietly lonely in a way he had almost convinced himself did not matter. He kept moving through the blizzard. He found the hitching post in front of the general store by walking into it with his hip. He found the water trough frozen solid under its cap of snow by nearly falling over it. He navigated by the feel of the packed earth road under his boots, even under the drifts, because packed earth is different from the loose fill on either side of it, and he could feel the difference through his soles. 3 times the wind hit him with such force that he had to stop and turn sideways and brace until it eased. He did not fall. He was not built for falling. Dr. Horace Price was 62 years old and had been practicing medicine in the Western Territories since before the war. He had seen everything. He had set bones by firelight, delivered babies in the backs of wagons, dug bullets out of men on barroom tables, and once removed a man's gangrenous foot with a saw and a prayer in the middle of a prairie thunderstorm. He was not easily impressed, but when he opened his door at 11 o'clock on a blizzard night and found Callum Hayes standing on his porch with snow packed into every crease and fold of his coat and his eyebrows gone white with frost and his breath coming in great steaming clouds, even Doc Price blinked. "Good God, man," the doctor said. "It is the schoolteacher," Callum said, and his voice had not changed, still level, still controlled, still that same settled calm. "Miss Calloway. She is over at the schoolhouse with a high fever and a bad cough that I do not like the sound of. I think you need to come." "In this?" Doc Price said, and looked past Callum at the raging dark. "She needs a doctor," Callum said. Just that. No argument, no persuasion, no appeal. Just the fact of it, stated with a finality that closed the door on any discussion. Doc Price looked at him for one more moment, then turned back into the house and began pulling on his coat. The walk back was worse, because they were heading into the wind this time, and Doc Price was older and slower and had to lean hard against Callum's arm. But Callum knew the way back the same as he had known the way there, and he put the doctor on his right side and took the brunt of the wind on his left and moved them both forward through the white with the slow, grinding, irresistible patience of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and exactly why. They reached the schoolhouse in what felt like an hour, but was probably 20 minutes. Callum pushed the door open, and the warmth from the rebuilt fire came out to meet them, and he practically carried the doctor through the door, and Doc Price spent a moment unwrapping and coughing and stomping snow from his boots, and Callum went straight to the stove and put more wood in because the fire had dropped while he was gone, and then he turned around to look at Eliza. She was still in the cot. She had been awake. He could see that she had been watching the door. And when he came in, she had closed her eyes for a moment in a way that looked like relief, just pure and simple relief. And that expression did something to Callum that he was not prepared for. Something in his chest shifted, rearranged itself, settled into a new configuration, like a bone, finding a socket it had not known was empty. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," he said. Doc Price was already crossing to her, his bag in hand, his professional manner resettling over him like a second coat now that he was out of the cold. He sat on the edge of the cot and spoke to her quietly, while Callum stood by the stove and watched and felt the warmth return to his hands and face in the stinging waves that came with thawing. And he watched Eliza Calloway answer the doctor's questions with her eyes on the doctor, but her chin steady and her hands folded on the quilt in a display of composure that cost her something. He could see it costing her. And he thought, she is not going to let herself be afraid in front of people if she can help it. He recognized that particular kind of toughness, the internal variety, the kind that nobody gave you credit for because it did not make noise. The doctor listened to her chest with his stethoscope, and then he listened again, and his face did a careful thing where it became very neutral, and Callum took note of that, and did not like it. Doc Price stood up and came over to where Callum was standing and spoke quietly. "It is pneumonia," he said. "Both lungs, from the sound of it. She's been sick longer than she told me, I suspect." He looked at Callum with the steady assessment of a man who has learned to deliver bad news efficiently. "She needs to be kept warm. She needs willow bark tea for the fever and mustard plaster for the chest. I have medicine in my bag, quinine and something for the cough, but mostly what she needs is warmth, rest, and somebody with her. She cannot be alone tonight." "I will stay," Callum said. Doc Price raised an eyebrow, and Callum met his eyes and said nothing further, and after a moment the doctor nodded and turned back to his patient. He worked for 30 minutes, administering the medicine and showing Callum where the mustard and cloth were in the supply chest, explaining carefully how to make the plaster and how often to change it, how to brew the willow bark tea that Eliza had in a tin on her kitchen shelf, how to watch the fever, and what signs would mean things had gotten worse, what would mean they had gotten better. He wrote instructions in his cramped doctor's hand on a piece of paper and gave it to Callum, and Callum read it through twice and folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "I will come back in the morning," Doc Price said, "assuming this storm has eased by then." He looked at the window, which was rattling steadily in the wind. "If it is not eased, I will come anyway." He paused and looked again at Callum, and there was something knowing in his old eyes that Callum chose to ignore. "She is lucky you came for her, Hayes." "She had nobody else," Callum said. "No," Doc Price agreed quietly. "She did not." The doctor wrapped himself back up and went out into the storm, and Callum closed the door behind him and turned around, and it was just the two of them in the small room with the fire and the blizzard and the night. He stood at the foot of the cot and she looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The fire popped and sent a spray of orange sparks against the stove grate. The wind outside was like something from another world, savage and indifferent and very far removed from the warm stillness between them right now. "You went out in that for me," she said. It was not quite a question. "You were sick," he said. "The doctor was needed." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her working something through behind those gray eyes. "Sit down," she said finally. "If you are going to stay, and I think you are, then you should not stand there at the end of my bed like a sentry. Pull that chair over, please." He did, and the chair creaked beneath him in a way that seemed genuinely alarmed, but it held, and he sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and slowly, tentatively, something that was not quite ease but was reaching in that direction began to settle between them. "Tell me about your cabin," she said. "Up on the ridge." He looked at her, surprised. "You want to hear about my cabin?" "I want to hear a voice," she said, simply and honestly. "The wind is very loud and I have been very alone today, and your voice is... it is the kind of voice that makes the wind seem quieter. So please, tell me about your cabin." He looked at her for another long moment, and then he began to talk. He told her about the cabin, the way he had spent 2 full summers building it, felling the trees and peeling the bark and notching the logs, the way the roof had collapsed in the 3rd winter and he had rebuilt it better, the way it sat in a clearing so positioned that the wind from the north broke against the ridge before it reached the walls. He told her about the creek that ran 40 yards behind it, black water and fast even in winter because of the springs that fed it upstream. He told her about the view from the front step on a clear morning, the whole valley laid out below with the cottonwoods pale and silver along Silver Run, and the town of Granger's Pass, just a cluster of dark shapes in the distance, smoking up into a pale sky. She listened with her eyes half closed and the quilt pulled up to her chin, and gradually the tension in her body, the tight braced quality that illness and fear and being alone had put into her, began to ease. Her breathing steadied. The worst of the shaking slowed. Around midnight, the fever spiked again. He saw it happen, saw the color drain from her face and the shaking start, the deep full-body trembling that came up from somewhere below her control, her hands beginning to vibrate against the quilt. She was trying to hold herself still, pressing her lips together, gripping the edge of the blanket with both hands, and he could see that it was taking everything she had. He was already moving. He got up from the chair and crouched beside the cot and put his hand over both of hers. His one hand was enough to cover both of her small ones entirely, and he held them. That was all. He just held them, steady and warm, with a gentleness that felt extraordinary in a man his size, and he felt her hands shaking against his palm, and he said quietly, "I have you. You are all right." She looked at him. Her eyes were fever-bright and very wide, and there was something naked in them, something stripped of the composure she had been maintaining, and beneath it he could see how frightened she was, not of dying exactly, but of the suffering, and of being alone in it. He understood that particular fear. He understood it in a way that had nothing to do with words. "It is going to get better," he said. "I know it does not feel like that right now, but it is. The medicine will work. The fever will break. I've seen it before." "Have you?" she managed, her voice barely there. "Yes." He tightened his hold on her hands, very slightly, just enough that she could feel it. "I'm not going anywhere. You understand me? I'm going to be right here." She looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her face, a yielding, a letting go of some last held breath, and the tears that had been threatening all evening finally spilled over, quiet and private, not theatrical, but real. She turned her face a little toward the wall, instinctively, ashamed of them, and he reached up with his free hand and turned her face back, gently, with 2 fingers at her jaw. "Do not do that," he said. "You do not have to hold everything together tonight, not with me." She cried then, quietly, and he held her hands, and the blizzard howled outside, and the fire burned warm and steady, and Callum Hayes sat beside the cot of a woman he had met 3 hours ago, and felt something happening inside him that he could not name but recognized by the way it frightened him, a recognition, a resonance, as if some part of himself that had been closed for a very long time was considering, for the first time in years, opening again. He brewed the willow bark tea when she stopped shaking and helped her drink it, holding the tin cup steady because her hands were still trembling, and he changed the mustard plaster on her chest, with his eyes carefully averted and his movements as professional as he could make them, following the doctor's instructions exactly. He fed the fire every hour, and between those hours he sat in the chair beside her and talked when she wanted talking, and was quiet when she wanted quiet. And sometime in the deep middle of the night she fell asleep while he was describing the way the ice formed along Silver Creek in early November, frost flowers crystallizing along the banks in shapes so complicated they looked like lace, and he watched her sleep and felt the tight knot of fear in his chest slowly ease. The storm eased before dawn. It did not end. Wyoming blizzards do not end quickly. They are grudging and stubborn. But the wind dropped below a howl to something closer to a moan, and the snow went from horizontal to diagonal, and by the time the first gray light showed at the east window, Callum could see across the schoolyard, could see the white geometry of drifts and the dark lines of the fence posts and the pale smudge of the tree line beyond. The world had the clean, exhausted stillness that comes after a great storm, everything wrecked and quiet and white. He had not slept. He did not feel the absence of sleep in the way he sometimes did. No heaviness, no fog. He felt, in fact, very alert in the specific way that comes from caring deeply about something, from watching something valuable with all your attention. He checked on Eliza. Her brow was damp with the cooling sweat of a fever breaking, and he touched it with the back of his fingers and felt that the worst of the heat was gone. She was sleeping deeply, and her color, while still not healthy, was no longer the alarming flush of last night. He sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly through his nose and scrubbed both hands over his face and allowed himself 1 full minute of simple, pure relief. She woke up around 7 in the morning, just as the sky outside had gone from gray to a pale and watery winter blue. She woke slowly, surfacing from sleep in stages, and he watched her eyes open and find the ceiling, and then find him, and he watched the moment of confusion as she assembled the pieces, the schoolhouse, the night, the storm, the doctor, the man in the chair beside her cot, and he watched the confusion settle into something warmer. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was still rough, but it was better, more like her voice, and the words came out without the terrible effort of last night. "Good morning," he said. "How do you feel?" She considered this with evident seriousness. "Better," she said. "Genuinely better. The shaking has stopped." She lifted one hand and looked at it, and it was steady, mostly steady, with only a faint residual tremble. She lowered it and looked at him. "Did you sleep at all?" "No," he said. "Callum." "You needed watching," he said. She looked at him steadily, and the expression on her face was something he did not have a name for, but that he felt all the way through his chest. "You are a very extraordinary man," she said quietly. "I want you to know that I know that." He looked at his hands. He was not a man who received compliments gracefully. "I did what was needed," he said. "You went out in a blizzard," she said. "You walked through a whiteout storm in the middle of the night to get a doctor for a woman you barely knew, and then you stayed up all night to keep her alive, and now you're going to sit there and tell me you only did what was needed." Callum Hayes. "Look at me." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. And the way she said it, quiet, direct, no formality in it, just the raw weight of genuine gratitude from one person to another, landed on him like a hand placed over his heart. "You are welcome, Eliza," he said. Doc Price came by at 9, pushing through the new-fallen drifts with his black bag and his gray wool scarf, and he confirmed what Callum had already suspected. The worst had passed. The fever was down, the cough was still bad, but losing the wet sound that had frightened the doctor the night before, and with continued rest and the medicines he left and the teas he prescribed, she would recover fully. He said this with the satisfaction of a craftsman whose work has come out well, and then he looked at Callum with the same knowing expression he had worn the night before, and said, "You did good, Hayes." She would not have made it through the night alone. After the doctor left, Callum built up the fire, and then sat back down in the chair, and Eliza looked at him from the cot, and there was a comfortable silence between them for a while, the kind of silence that takes time to grow, that has to be earned, and it seemed remarkable to both of them that it had grown so quickly. "Tell me about yourself," she said. And so he did. He told her more than he told most people, about growing up in Missouri, the third of 4 boys in a family that had been broken by debt and hard luck, before he was old enough to understand what those things meant. He told her about his father, who had been a decent man ground down to nothing by a stretch of bad harvests, and a banker who had no patience for decency. He told her about leaving at 17 with his older brother James, heading west to trap, and about James being killed in a river accident 2 winters in, and about the weight of that, and how the mountains had become his way of carrying it, moving through wilderness, being useful, being alone without being lonely. He told her about the years of solitude, the cabin, the trapping lines, the way the seasons changed up on the ridge in colors so vivid and particular that no painting had ever come close to capturing them. She listened to all of it without interrupting, with her gray eyes on him and her hands quiet on the quilt, and when he finished, she said, "You have been alone for a very long time." It was not an accusation. It was not pity. It was just an observation, stated with the precision of someone who understood loneliness from the inside. "Yes," he said. "So have I," she said, "in different ways. But yes." She told him her own story then, the mother who had raised her alone after her father left, the hunger of those years that was not only for food but for stability, for a future that felt real. She told him about reading everything she could get her hands on, about the teacher in Cincinnati who had told her she was clever enough to teach, about the correspondence with the school board in Wyoming territory that had offered her the position in Granger's Pass, and about the fear and the excitement of arriving, and about the 6 months of building something here, the curtains, the rug, the careful stack of books, and about how much it meant to her in a way that was hard to explain to people who had always had a home. "I understand that," Callum said. "I think you might," she said. The days that followed were quiet and slow and full of a particular kind of sweetness that surprised both of them with its depth. The blizzard had moved east and left behind a clean white world, and Granger's past dug itself out with the cheerful, practical vigor of a frontier town that had survived many such storms, and life resumed its rhythms. But Callum did not go back to his cabin. He told himself, the first day, that he was staying because she was still unwell. He told himself, the second day, that it was because the roads up to the ridge were still impassable. By the third day, he had stopped telling himself things and was simply making her soup from the dried beef and beans in her pantry, and chopping and stacking a new supply of firewood by her door, and sitting in the chair in the evenings while she read to him from the books on her shelf. She had a copy of Dickens that she read with great expression, doing all the voices, and he found that he could not stop watching her face while she read, the way it moved through every feeling the words described, as if her whole self was porous to story. Mrs. Hensley came by with food and gossip and bright, interested eyes that took in Callum's coat on the peg and his presence in the chair and filed all of it away with great satisfaction. Tommy Marsh's mother came by to apologize for sending a trapper to do a neighbor's work and to thank Callum with a sincerity that made him uncomfortable because he still did not know what to do with thanks. The children came back to school on the fourth day, pressing their faces against the window glass to see their teacher through the panes, and Eliza waved at them from the cot and made Callum go out and tell them she would be teaching again next Monday, which he did, with great awkwardness that apparently amused every child in the schoolyard enormously. He went back into the schoolhouse to find her laughing. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a real laugh, not a polite one, full and warm, with her head tipped back and her eyes crinkled, and it hit him somewhere below the ribs with a force that nearly rocked him back on his heels. "What did you say to them?" she asked. "I said you would be back Monday and they should go home," he said. "The expression on your face," she said, still laughing. "They will be telling that story for years." "I do not spend much time with children," he said, and sat back down in the chair, and looked at her laughing, and felt something so large and warm moving through him that it was almost frightening. He went to Burl Atkins's general store on the fifth day to replenish what he had used from Eliza's pantry, and Burl, who was 50 years old and shaped like a barrel and knew everything about everyone in Granger's Pass, looked at him over the counter with an expression of great wisdom and said, "So, you have been tending the schoolteacher." "She was ill," Callum said. "She is better now from what I hear," Burl said. "She is recovering." "Still needs tending, does she?" Callum looked at him. Burl's expression was entirely innocent and utterly full of meaning. "Put those on my account," Callum said, and picked up the supplies and left. He thought about what Burl had not said as he walked back through the snow-packed street. He thought about what he was doing here, still in town, still finding reasons, and he made himself think about it clearly, the way he thought about everything important, without sentiment or self-deception. He was a mountain man. He lived on a ridge above a timber line. He came into town 4 or 5 times a year, and he had no gift for company and no talent for the ordinary human business of being in other people's daily lives. He was 32 years old, and he had chosen solitude a long time ago, and he had been, on the whole, at peace with that choice. He pushed open the schoolhouse door, and Eliza looked up from the book in her lap and smiled at him. And the smile went through him like sunlight through a winter window, warm and specific and choosing, and the thought he had been building on the walk over, all the sensible, reasonable, protective thoughts about solitude and practicality, dissolved entirely. He set the supplies on her kitchen shelf and turned around, and she was watching him with that particular gray-eyed steadiness of hers. "You went to the store," she observed. "Your pantry was low. You did not have to do that." "I know." He sat down. "I wanted to." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, the way she said careful things, directly but gently, "You have stayed 5 days." "Yes." "Your trapping lines will be waiting." "Yes," he said, "they will." Another silence. She folded the corner of her book and set it aside, and she looked at him, and he looked back, and all the things that had been growing between them in the warmth of this small room over these 5 days were very present right now, very alive. "Callum," she said, "I would like to tell you something, and I need you to not be strange about it." "All right," he said, not at all sure he could promise that. "I'm glad you stayed," she said, "and not only because I needed help. I'm glad because I like you. I like talking to you, and I like the silence with you, and I like that you are honest without being unkind. And I'm glad you came through that blizzard, and I'm glad you sat in that chair and held my hands when I was shaking, and I would like—" She stopped. She took a breath. The composure she normally wore like armor was nowhere to be seen, and he could see the courage it was taking her to continue. "I would like it if you came to visit, after you go back, if you wanted to." Callum Hayes sat in the creaking chair in Eliza Calloway's schoolhouse and looked at this woman who had crossed half a country alone and built a home from curtains and books and sheer stubborn will, and who was now looking at him with those clear gray eyes and doing the terrifying, honest thing of telling the truth about what she wanted. And he thought, I have been alone 11 years, and this is the first thing in 11 years that has felt more important than the solitude. "I will come back," he said. And the way he said it was different from the way he had said it the night of the blizzard. That had been a promise made in the heat of practical necessity. This was different. This was something else entirely. She smiled, and the smile was smaller and quieter and more private than the laughing one had been. And somehow it was more devastating. "Good," she said. He went back to the ridge the next morning when the road was passable. He did not make a production of it. He packed up the few things he had brought down from the cabin, and he made sure the wood box was full and the fire was set for the day, and he stood in the doorway of her small bedroom room. Her curtains were pale in the winter morning light, that dried lavender color, and he looked at her where she sat in the cot, better now, genuinely better, her color healthy and her eyes clear, and her hair loose around her shoulders in the particular way it fell when she had not yet pinned it up for the day. "I will be back in 10 days, he said, "sooner if the weather permits." 10 days, she agreed. "I will have finished the Dickens by then." "Read something new," he said. "We will start fresh." He held her gaze for one last moment, and then he turned and walked out into the winter morning and down the snow-packed street and up the mountain trail toward the ridge. And he did not look back, because if he looked back, he might not go. Up on the ridge, the winter was clean and cold and quiet in the way it always was, and the cabin was exactly as he had left it, and his trapping lines needed attention, and the life he had built here was exactly as it had been. But something in it was different now, or rather, he was different in it, as if the angle had shifted slightly and certain things he had not noticed before were now in the light. The silence, which had always been a friend, now sometimes felt merely quiet. The evenings, which had always been enough, sometimes had a gap in them. He caught himself, 3 days in, thinking about something Eliza had said. A small thing, nothing important, just a remark she had made about the way the mountains looked on clear days from the schoolhouse window, how she could see the ridgeline, and had thought about what it was like up there. He had been checking a beaver trap at the time, and he had stopped in the cold and stood still for a moment, holding the thought. He worked his lines and kept his cabin and ate his meals alone and went to sleep in the dark, and on the 7th day he packed a supply bag and went down the mountain. He did not wait for the 10 days. She was back at school by the time he arrived, standing at the chalkboard with a piece of chalk in her hand and 12 children at their desks, and a look of such focused, purposeful engagement on her face that he stopped outside the window for a moment just to watch. She was good at it. He could see that even through glass, the way she moved and spoke and drew the children's attention, the way her face was animated and bright, the way she used her hands, the way she turned from the board, and the whole room turned with her like sunflowers toward light. He waited until school was dismissed and the children had gone home in a tumbling, shouting stream, and then he knocked on the schoolhouse door, and when she opened it, her face did the thing he had been thinking about all the way down the mountain, the lit-up thing, the specific thing, and she said, "You are early." "The weather permitted," he said. She let him in, and he ducked under the doorframe and stood in the empty schoolroom, which he had not seen properly before, and he looked at her bookshelves and the handwritten lessons on the chalkboard and the children's drawings pinned to the wall above the window, and something moved through him that was very close to awe. "You built something here," he said. "I'm trying to," she said. "No." He looked at her. "You have. These children. You can see it in how they—" He stopped, searching for words which were not his strongest instrument. "When you were teaching just now, through the window, they were all watching you, and not one of them was anywhere else. You have that gift." She was quiet for a moment. You were watching through the window. I did not want to interrupt. A small smile crossed her face, and then a more serious expression followed it, and she said, "Sit down, Callum. I want to tell you about my week." He sat, and she told him about Monday, the first day back, and how her lungs had still been weak and she had had to stop twice to catch her breath, and how young Robert Hensley had brought her a cup of water without being asked, just quietly and gravely, and how that small act of unprompted kindness had made her cry a little on the inside. She told him about Tuesday, when she had found a dead bird on the front step, placed there by some unknown child as a kind of tribute in the manner of small children everywhere. She told him about the letter she had received from the school board in Laramie, asking her progress report, and about the other letter, the personal one from a cousin in Ohio, who wanted to know if she was coming home for Christmas. "Are you?" he asked. "Going home for Christmas?" "This is home," she said, simply, firmly, with the same ferocity he had noticed the very first time he had tried to think about what this place meant to her. "I am not going back to Ohio." He sat with that for a moment, and then he said, "I would like to take you somewhere, if you are well enough. Tomorrow, if the sky holds clear." She looked at him curiously. "Where?" "Up the mountain," he said. "Not all the way to the cabin, just to the first overlook. About an hour's walk on a good trail. I want to show you something." "What something?" "If I told you, it would not be worth the walk," he said. She considered him. "Will there be bears?" "Not in this weather. They are asleep." "Good," she said. "I would like that, then. Bring your buffalo coat. I've been told the wind on that mountain is something remarkable." He almost said, "I know. I live there." But he was looking at the expression on her face, and he was aware that she was teasing him, gently, for the pleasure of it, and it was such an ordinary and sweet human thing that he just said, "I will." They went the next morning, a Tuesday of bright, hard winter sunlight and cold that bit and sparkled, the sky above the peaks that particular shade of deep winter blue that looks like it has been polished. Eliza wore her wool coat and 2 scarves and her stout leather boots, and she walked beside him up the mountain trail with her chin up and her breath coming in white puffs and her eyes moving over everything, taking it in. He had set the pace slower than he would walk alone, accounting for the altitude and her recent illness, and she kept it without apparent effort, which he found quietly impressive. The overlook was a shelf of rock at the top of a long switchback, sheltered on 3 sides by lodgepole pine, open to the south where the valley lay below. They came out of the trees and onto the rock, and Eliza stopped, and for a long moment she did not say anything. Below them, the valley of Granger's Pass was spread out in white and winter gold, the creek a dark thread through the snow, the town a small cluster of dark and brown, and the white smoke of morning fires rising into the still air in thin vertical lines that the cold held perfectly upright. Beyond the valley, the eastern ridges ran blue-gray and immense against that polished sky. The snow on the nearer slopes had the texture of cut crystal, each facet catching the sun in its own color. It was enormous and still, and there was no other word for it, magnificent. "Oh," Eliza breathed. Then, "Oh, Callum." "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him, and her eyes were very bright, and the cold had put color in her cheeks, and she looked healthy and alive and present in a way that went through him like a chord of music, rich and full. "You see this," she said, "whenever you want. You live up here, and this is simply your world." "Yes," he said. "And you came down to live in it," she said softly, and he was not sure exactly what she meant, but he understood that she meant something true. He said, "Eliza," and his voice came out different from how he intended, quieter, rougher, with something in it that had not been there before, or had been there but had not found its way out until this moment. She looked at him. "I have been alone for a long time," he said. "I chose that. I was good at it. I am good at it." He stopped. He was not a man of many words, and this was requiring many words, and he was fighting through it because it needed to be said, and he was, above everything else, honest. "I have been coming back to town more often in my head all week than I have in 11 years of living up here. And the thing that is different is you. And I think you should know that. And I think I think I want to know if you would consider. He stopped again. Eliza Calloway looked at him with those clear gray eyes, and the slight wind moved a strand of hair across her face, and she reached up and tucked it back, and she said, "Yes." He blinked. "Yes? Yes, Callum. I would consider it." And there was the smile again, not the polite one, and not even the warm one, but the new one, the private one, the one he was beginning to understand was only his. He reached out and took her hand, and she had gloves on, and he had gloves on, and he could feel almost nothing through the wool. But still, the connection was there, warm and real, and she squeezed his fingers, and he squeezed back, and they stood on the overlook together and looked out over the valley and the sky. And it was the simplest and most extraordinary thing he had ever experienced. Winter gave way to spring slowly, the way it does in the high country, grudgingly, degree by degree, the snow retreating up the slopes as the sun gained strength, the creek thawing and running loud over its stones, the first tentative shoots of green showing in the south-facing meadows when March was half over. And through the whole long silver passage of those weeks, Callum came down from the ridge and Eliza came up the mountain trail, and they spent their time in the particular joyful earnestness of two people discovering each other. He learned that she had strong opinions about almost everything, and was not shy about sharing them, but that she listened to other views with a genuine attention that she had clearly cultivated on purpose, because she believed listening to be as important as speaking. He learned that she was funny, quietly, precisely funny, with a dry observation that landed when you least expected it, and that she enjoyed his laugh, the rare, full one that she was apparently collecting. He learned that she could not cook well, but was enthusiastic about trying, and that she accepted his honest assessments of her cooking results with philosophical grace. He learned that she was afraid of nothing she could see plainly, but that ambiguity frightened her, not knowing what was coming, not knowing where she stood. He tried, in his imperfect and deliberate way, to be someone she always knew where she stood with. She learned that he was a man of deep and genuine capability, that there was almost nothing physical or practical he could not do, from building and repairing to hunting and trapping and tracking, and that these abilities were not things he was proud of in a vain way, but simply things he was, the vocabulary of his life. She learned that he was better with silence than with talking, but that his talk, when it came, was worth the wait. She learned that he had a patience that was almost geological, that he could wait for things, could let things develop at their own pace without forcing them, and that this patience came from a genuine trust in natural processes rather than from passivity. She learned that he was startlingly well-read, had packed books up to that cabin over the years in his supply loads, and that he had opinions about Dickens and Cooper and Shakespeare that she found both surprising and genuinely interesting. She learned that the hands that could split a cord of wood without apparent effort, or haul a full-grown elk a mile through mountain terrain, were capable of extraordinary gentleness, and she thought about that often, the paradox of it, the way that kind of gentleness meant more because it came from that kind of strength. In April, on a day when the first real warmth had returned to the valley and the cottonwoods along Silver Run were putting out their first pale gold-green leaves, Callum came down from the mountain with a look on his face that Eliza had not seen before, a considering look, a careful one, like a man moving through complex terrain and paying close attention to his footing. They walked beside the creek, as they often did in the evenings, and the water was high and fast with snowmelt, roaring along between its banks in a white rush, and the cottonwood leaves turned and flashed in the late light, and Eliza was talking about a letter she had received from the school board proposing a slight expansion of her curriculum, and she noticed that Callum was quiet, in a way that was not his usual easy quiet, but something more particular, and she stopped talking and looked at him. "What is it?" she asked. He stopped walking and turned to face her, and the evening light was on his face, the strong jaw, the dark eyes, the scar along his cheekbone that he had from a fall a long time ago that he had never fully explained. And he said, without preamble, without ceremony, in the direct and honest way that was entirely his own, "I want to marry you, Eliza." She looked at him. "I know it is early by some people's reckoning," he said. "I know we have only known each other since January. I know I am not what most women would call a conventional choice. I live on a mountain, and I am not easy company, and I do not know the first thing about being somebody's husband. But I know that you are the most—" He stopped, and the slight hesitation was so unlike him that it told her more than any word could. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known. And I want to come down from that mountain for good. I want to build something here, with you, if you will let me." Eliza stood on the bank of Silver Run with the evening light in her eyes and the sound of the water all around them, and she thought about the morning in January when she had lain in the cot in the dark and listened to the fire die, and thought she might not survive the night. She thought about the 3 hard knocks on the door, and the door opening, and the snow-dusted man who had ducked under the frame and looked at her with those steady dark eyes. She thought about his hand covering her shaking ones in the middle of the night, and the sound of his voice making the wind quieter, and the view from the overlook, and the way he listened to her when she talked, and the way she felt in the mornings since she had known him, like the world had more light in it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Callum. I will marry you." He crossed the space between them in one stride, and took her face in his 2 enormous hands with a gentleness that still amazed her, and kissed her, and the cottonwoods turned their new leaves in the wind above them, and the creek ran cold and fast and joyful beside them. And it was, Eliza thought, exactly right. The wedding was in June, which gave the mountain a proper spring and gave the town of Granger's Pass the time to be thoroughly excited about it, which it was. Mrs. Hensley organized a reception with a ferocity of purpose that was deeply intimidating to everyone except Eliza, who found it touching. Burl Atkins contributed a case of his best imported preserves from the store and spent a week pretending he hadn't seen this coming for months. Doc Price, who was asked to stand witness, accepted with a quiet satisfaction that suggested he felt some personal credit was due, and perhaps it was. Callum brought the cabin down the mountain in pieces, in a manner of speaking. He spent April and May building a proper house at the edge of town, on a lot he purchased from the town council, a house that was small but solidly built, with walls of lodgepole pine and a stone hearth that he laid himself, and a porch that faced south toward the mountains, and a window beside the kitchen table that caught the morning light. He built it the way he built everything, with absolute attention, taking the time each step required, not rushing any joint or corner. He built furniture too, a table and 2 chairs and a bed frame of oak that he had brought down from the timber, smooth and strong and built to last. He put up shelves along the bedroom wall for Eliza's books, running them all the way to the ceiling. Eliza came by on the day the shelves were finished, when the house was nearly done, and walked through the rooms with her hands at her sides and her eyes moving over everything, and he watched her face take it in. She stopped at the bedroom wall of shelves, and her hand went up and touched the wood, and she said nothing for a long moment. "There is room for more books," he said from the doorway. She turned around, and her eyes were very bright. "Room for more books," she said. "I do not know if I have ever been given a more perfect thing." They were married on the 20th of June, in the small white church at the top of the main street, with the summer morning coming through the windows in long, warm shafts, and the whole town of Granger's Pass in the pews, which was to say a little under 200 people, which was to say the whole town. Eliza wore a dress of ivory cotton that Mrs. Hensley and 2 other women had helped her make, and her dark hair was pinned up with 2 tortoiseshell combs, and she carried a bunch of wild mountain flowers that Callum had gone up to the ridge to gather at dawn, blue and white and pale gold against the ivory. Callum stood at the front of the church in the best clothes he owned, which were a dark jacket and clean trousers and a white shirt that was slightly too tight across the shoulders, and he stood with his hands at his sides and watched her come up the aisle toward him, and the expression on his face was one that the women of Granger's Pass would describe for years afterward as the most extraordinary thing they had ever seen on a man who was generally considered not to make expressions, not overwhelmed, not overcome, but rather settled, finally settled, the look of a man who has come through a long, hard journey and arrived somewhere he recognizes as the place he has been walking toward all along. They said their vows to each other in low, certain voices, looking at each other the whole time. When the minister said he could kiss his bride, Callum took her face in his hands again, as he had beside the creek, with that gentleness that was his particular secret, and kissed her, and the whole church made a noise that Eliza would later describe as the happiest sound she had ever heard. The summer that followed was the happiest of both their lives, though neither of them said that out loud to each other until much later. They lived in the new house and fell into the rhythms of shared days, Eliza at school in the mornings, teaching with the dedication and joy that she brought to it, Callum doing the work of the property and the occasional guided hunting or tracking work for the cattle ranches farther east of town, which provided an income that supplemented what he still made from trapping in the winter. They ate their meals together and argued about books and took their Sunday walks up the mountain trail to the overlook, which had become their place, and they talked and were quiet and learned each other in all the ordinary daily ways that are, in fact, the truest kind of knowing. He kept the cabin on the ridge. He went up every few weeks to check on it, for old time's sake, and because he was a man who did not abandon the things that had kept him alive, and sometimes he brought her with him on the longer autumn weekends when school was not in session. She loved it. She loved the strangeness of it, the altitude, the silence that was different from any silence she had ever known, not an absence of sound, but a presence of something else, the sound of pure space. She loved the view from the front step, the same view he had described to her that first night of the blizzard, and she told him he had not done it justice. "I know," he said. "I was not sure you would believe me." "You could have said it was the most magnificent thing on earth," she said, "and it still would not have been enough." In the early fall, she told him she was expecting. She told him at breakfast, directly, the way she told him everything, and she watched his face move through a series of expressions that were quick and internal and unlike anything she had seen in him before. A flash of something like terror, quickly absorbed, and then something that opened like a door opening, warm and immense and very bright. He stood up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and pulled her up from the chair and held her, and she felt his hands on her back and his face against her hair, and he said, into her hair, very quietly, "We are going to be good at this." "I know," she said. "I think we are going to be extraordinary at this." He pulled back and looked at her, and his eyes were doing something that she had only seen twice before, in the church and on the overlook, a softness that he did not keep covered very well when she was the cause of it. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said immediately, and the honesty of it made her laugh, and the laugh made him smile, and she put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him once, hard, and said, "Good. We can be frightened together then." The winter of 1878 and 1879 had been the one that nearly killed her. The winter of 1879 and 1880 was different in every way. She was warm and safe and well, in her own house with her own hearth and her husband beside her, and when the blizzards came down from the northwest and the wind hit the solid walls of the house Callum had built, the house did not shudder. It held. In the deep of that winter, Eliza would sometimes wake in the early hours and lie still in the dark and listen to the wind, and she would think about the night of the first blizzard, the dying fire, the empty room, the loneliness that had been so large it had started to feel like a physical thing. She would think about the 3 knocks on the door. She would think about the man who had come in out of the storm, and she would feel, beside her in the warm dark, the solid weight and warmth of Callum, asleep and breathing, present, real, hers. And the contrast between those two versions of a blizzard night was so absolute and so extraordinary that sometimes she had to press her lips together against something that was not quite laughing and not quite crying, but was located somewhere near both. She would reach across in the dark and find his hand, which was always there, and hold it. He always held back, even half asleep. Even in the deepest part of the night without waking fully, his hand always found hers and held on. Their son was born in April of 1880, on a morning that came with a soft, warm rain that had been washing the last snow from the valley all night, and the creek ran high and musical, and the first green of the cottonwoods was just beginning. Doc Price was there, this time, called for in good time and in ordinary weather, walking up the main street with his black bag at a civilized hour. And Mrs. Hensley was there, and Callum was there, in the way that Callum was always there when Eliza needed him, solid and steady and enduring. The baby was strong and loud, with dark hair like his father and gray eyes like his mother, and when Callum held him for the first time, this tiny thing in those enormous hands that had built a house and fought a blizzard and held a shaking woman's hands in the dark, Something final and permanent settled into the architecture of him, something that had been shifting toward its foundation for the better part of 2 years and was now set. They named him James Elias Hayes. James for the brother lost on the river who deserved to be remembered, and Elias because Eliza said it sounded like both of them put together, which made Callum look at her with an expression she loved and could never quite describe. The years that came after were full and good and particular in the way that real lives are particular. Not fairy tales, not smooth and frictionless, but textured with ordinary difficulty and extraordinary joy, and the daily miracle of two people who have chosen each other and keep choosing each other in all the small practical ways that the choosing really lives. The school grew, because Granger's Pass grew as the railroad pushed closer and new families came into the valley, and Eliza fought for and received the funds for a second teacher, a young woman from Denver named Agnes, whom she mentored with a generosity that came directly from her own memory of arriving somewhere new without enough support. She took her teaching seriously as a calling, not merely a profession, and the children of Granger's Pass were better for it in ways that would not fully reveal themselves for another generation. Callum built the house an extension, a proper parlor and a second bedroom for when James was big enough to need his own space, and later a third bedroom because there was a daughter on the way, and he built those rooms with the same absolute attention he had brought to everything else. He did less trapping over the years and more building, because the valley needed people who could build well, and because a man's life shifts its shapes as it goes, and he had always known how to pay attention to where his use was needed. He was known in Granger's Pass the way solid, useful people are known, as someone you called for the hard thing, the problem without an easy solution, the situation that required someone who would not flinch. He was, in the clearest possible sense, someone you could count on. In the evenings, they sat together on the south-facing porch, and in the winter they sat together by the stone hearth that he had built with his own hands, and they talked and were quiet, and read their books and watched their children grow through the particular miracle of that watching, which astonishes every parent with its speed. James was 4 when his sister Clara was born, bright-eyed and black-haired and possessed from her earliest weeks of an opinion about everything, which her parents found both exhausting and deeply familiar. She had Callum's steadiness and Eliza's sharp tongue, and some combination of both of them that was entirely her own, and Callum, who had not been sure he could love another person the way he loved James, discovered with great wonder that love of that kind is not divided by the number of its objects, but rather multiplied. There were hard years, as there always are. The drought of 1882 hit the valley farmers hard, and the town went lean for 2 winters, and Callum shot elk and shared the meat because there was no question of doing otherwise. And Eliza taught through it all and kept the school open when some voices on the town council suggested it was an unnecessary expense in lean times. And she won that argument with a precision and force that put those voices permanently to rest. There were joys, too, and those were large. James, at 7, came home from school, from his mother's school, which gave the situation a wonderful complexity, with a drawing he had made of the mountain, rough and earnest and very recognizable, and presented it to Callum with great gravity, and Callum hung it on the wall of the parlor where it stayed for 30 years. Clara, at 5, fell in love with horses, and turned out to have a gift for them that was remarkable even in a horse country, and Callum built a small stable behind the house and taught her what he knew, which was considerable. One Sunday morning in the spring of 1883, Callum and Eliza went up to the overlook together, as they still did when the weather permitted and the children were with a neighbor. They stood on the familiar shelf of rock and looked out over the valley, which was green now with the full spring, the cottonwoods in full leaf along the creek, the town larger than it had been when she had arrived, a proper main street now with a proper hotel and a bank and a smithy that rang all day, the surrounding ranches and farms spreading out across the valley floor. "Do you remember," she said, "the first time you brought me here? You said you wanted to show me something and you would not tell me what." "I remember," he said. "I thought about it later," she said. "Why you brought me here, that particular thing. Did you figure it out?" She looked at him, the profile she knew as well as her own hand by now, the jaw and the brow and the long-ago scar and the dark hair, a little more silver in it now, still longer than fashion, still entirely him. "I think you wanted to show me what you loved," she said, "so that I could see it, and so that you could see if I was capable of loving it too." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Something like that." "Did I pass?" He turned to look at her, and the expression she loved so well was there, the open door of it, the warmth. "You looked at it the same way I look at it," he said. "That was, yes, you passed." She slipped her hand into his, and he held it, and they stood together on the overlook in the spring morning light and looked at the valley they had made their home in, and the smoke rising from the house that he had built for her below, and the sound of Silver Run came up to them faintly through the clean air, and everything was exactly as it should be. 2 more years passed, and James grew tall and serious and showed signs of wanting to be a doctor, which made Doc Price immensely pleased when he heard it, and which made Callum unexpectedly emotional in a way he kept to himself for about 20 minutes before telling Eliza, who told him that his inability to hide his feelings from her was one of her great pleasures in life. Clara's gift for horses had extended into a fearlessness about the high country that Callum recognized as his own in different form, and he took her up the ridge trail on a regular basis now, and she stood on the overlook with the same expression he had first seen on Eliza's face, that absorbing, receiving look, and it struck him, with a force that was quiet but very deep, that some things carry forward in ways you do not always anticipate, but that are, when you see them, exactly right. On a September evening in 1885, when the aspen on the slopes had gone all gold and the air had the first bite of coming winter in it, Eliza was at the kitchen table grading her pupil's work by lamplight, the way she often was at that hour, and Callum was on the porch in the last of the evening light, mending a piece of harness tack, and James was asleep, and Clara was at the table nearby drawing her horses, and the fire was going in the hearth, and the mountains stood above the valley in the dusk as they always did, solid and permanent and indifferent to everything except their own long existence. Callum came in from the porch and put the tack aside and stood in the doorway of the kitchen, and Eliza looked up from her papers, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the lamplight with the children between them and the fire behind them and the mountains outside. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. And then honestly, "Everything." She set down her pen. She knew that look. It was the overlook look, the church look, the look from the morning after the blizzard when she had woken up and found him still in the chair beside her bed, having not slept all night to keep her safe. It was the look of a man taking in something he considers irreplaceable. "Come here," she said. He crossed the kitchen and sat beside her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and Clara looked up from her drawing and regarded her parents with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has always known her parents to be like this, which is to say in love in a way that makes the world seem steadier. "Papa," Clara said, "did you really walk through a blizzard to get Dr. Price?" "Who told you that?" he said. "Mrs. Hensley," Clara said. "She says you went out in the worst blizzard in 10 years in the middle of the night, and that you could have died, and that you did it for Mama before you even knew her properly." Callum looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at Callum. A small private smile crossed both their faces in the same moment. "Mrs. Hensley talks a great deal," Callum said. "But is it true?" Clara pressed. "It is true," Eliza said, "every word of it." She looked up at Callum, and her gray eyes were very clear and warm. "Your father went out into a blizzard for me before he even knew my name, and then he sat up all night holding my hand so I would not be afraid." Clara considered this with the grave seriousness she brought to important things. "Why?" she said, looking at her father. Callum looked at his daughter and then at his wife, and then at the lamplight on the walls of the house he had built, and the books on their shelves, and the fire in the hearth, and the mountains in the dark outside the window. "Because she needed someone," he said, "and I was there." Eliza reached up and took his hand and held it, and he held hers back, and Clara seemed to accept this as a complete explanation, which it was. The lamp burned low as the night deepened around the house, and the mountains stood above Granger's Pass in the dark as they had stood for 10,000 years before anyone was here to see them, and the Silver Run moved through the valley below, and in the house at the edge of town that Callum Hayes had built with his own hands, the family he had never known he was building toward was all together in the lamplight, and warm, and home. Years later, many years when the children were grown and gone into their own large lives, and the town of Granger's Pass had grown into something that sometimes surprised them both with its size and noise and busyness, Eliza and Callum still sat together on the south-facing porch on the summer evenings and the stone hearth fireside in winter, and they still went up the mountain trail to the overlook when the weather permitted and their knees allowed, which they did with the stubborn regularity of two people who consider a thing important. James did become a doctor, trained in Denver, and returned to Granger's Pass, and there was a particular afternoon when Eliza watched her grown son walk up the main street with his black bag in his hand and his long stride and the same steady eyes as his father, and she had to sit down for a moment because the fullness of it was almost too much to bear. He married a quiet, sharp-minded woman named Louise, who had come west from St. Louis to work as a telegraph operator, and they had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and were happy in the practical, committed way that seemed to run in the family. Clara went north to Montana Territory when she was 20 and took a position managing a cattle operation for a ranching family in the Yellowstone Valley, which did not surprise anyone who had watched her grow up. She came back to visit twice a year with her horse and her stories and her opinions, and every time she came through the door of her parents' house, she filled it with the particular energy she had always had, and Callum would stand up and hold her at arm's length and look at her, this daughter who had the mountains in her, and his face would do the thing it always did around the people he loved. One November, when Callum was 61 and Eliza was 52, a storm rolled down from the northwest in the night. Not a blizzard. The worst blizzards belonged to the younger years, it seemed, but a serious winter storm with heavy snow and a wind that had some genuine intention behind it. They woke to it in the early morning, the familiar sound of the wind hitting the walls, and Eliza lay still for a moment and listened, as she always did, with the memory of that first winter night always somewhere in the back of her. She felt Callum's hand find hers in the dark, the way it always did. "It is a good storm," he said, his voice low and sleep-roughened. "It is," she agreed. They lay and listened to it for a while, the wind and the snow against the windows of the house he had built to hold against exactly this, and the fire still going in the hearth from the night before, and the warm dark around them, and the whole accumulated weight of the life they had built together present in every quiet and familiar inch of this room. "Do you remember," she said, not for the first time and not for the last, "the night you knocked on my door?" "I remember," he said. "You told me it was open. I could barely speak. You spoke well enough to make yourself heard." "I thought you were going to get yourself killed," she said, "going out in that storm." "I told you," he said, "not me." She laughed softly in the dark. She had laughed at that the first time, the sheer calm certainty of it, and she laughed at it still, not because it was funny exactly, but because it was so absolutely and entirely him, the same man at 61 as at 32, the same bedrock certainty in his own knowledge of himself and his capabilities, the same quiet, absolute presence. She turned toward him, and he was already there, his arm around her, her head against his chest, the familiar sound of his heartbeat that she had heard so many thousands of times in so many thousands of nights that it had become, long ago, the sound of safe. "I am glad it was you," she said. "Who knocked on that door?" His arm tightened around her, and he pressed his lips to the top of her head, and outside, the storm moved through the valley and the mountains stood above it all as they always had, and Silver Run went on under the ice, patient and cold and certain of the spring, and in the house at the edge of Granger's Pass, Wyoming Territory, the mountain man and the schoolteacher lay warm in the dark and held each other, as they had held each other through every storm and every calm since the night he had come through a blizzard for her. And the night was quiet, and the house was steady, and everything was whole.